Oh, to be young again, when all the world was bright and new. We all have fond memories of our childhoods and growing up. We all, of course, when we were young, we all had our first crush. Perhaps those were indeed Star Trek characters. But as well as having our first crush in form of characters, we all probably had our first crush in terms of starships. They may have been hero ships, or other background ships from the show, or perhaps fan ships that you had discovered online. But we all grew up with our own favourite ships that really inspired our imaginations. I can remember daydreaming about one particular ship, thinking about the adventures that it would go on and what it would be like to live and fly on one of these ships. And that ship was none other than the Hayden class. Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here, and today I consider this a little bit of a special episode. All ships are special and all starship designs are unique and beautiful in their own way, but I would say that this particular one is actually quite personal to me. As I say, I can remember seeing this ship when I was but a young boy. Yes, I was a young boy at one point in time. I know that's hard to imagine, but I can remember seeing this ship, and I can remember daydreaming and having fantasies about like being on this ship and going on adventures and being in the Star Trek universe, as I'm sure we all did. I want to talk about it today, not just to reminisce about those days and being young again, but also because now, with the wisdom of adulthood, I'm able to take a more precise look at the ship and really come to an even greater appreciation of it. When you're young, you're very easily impressed, and some things that really impressed you during childhood, you look back on as an adult and you feel embarrassed that you even liked it to begin with. But other things you come to an even deeper appreciation of. And with the Hayden class, it is the latter. I have come to a very deep appreciation of this design. So without any further ado, let's get into it. What is unique about the Hayden class specifically is that it is really the rebirth of a very, very old design lineage. Its nearest relation is the Akula class from the late 23rd and early 24th century. A ship that's primary service and primary mission saw it deployed on the neutral zone to defend against the threat that was, at the time, the Romulan Empire in the lead up to the Tomed incident. Now, of course, in the post-war world, there are but in fact two superpowers left standing, the Federation and the Romulans. And of course, tension between two such great powers is of course inevitable. This is where we see the start of the Hayden class as a response to this particular re-emergence of the Romulans. The other half is of course a response to the Dominion War, Starfleet ensuring that it doesn't end up with, as I mentioned before, a destroyer gap, constructing more escorts, creating genuine, small, capable attack ships, ideal for neutral zone patrol, and potentially in larger numbers, capable of wolf packing. So, let's take a quick look at the requirements that were issued for the Hayden class. So the requirements for the Hayden class went out actually quite late, probably about 2381, and the Hayden would see very rapid development. Partially this is of course due to its relatively small size, and also a lot of the technology is not particularly new, it's just bringing it into a compact little package. So the requirements for the Hayden class were as follows. Firstly, they wanted a small attack ship capable of self-defense. They wanted a ship that was capable of moderate-length border patrols, and that would have a powerful suite of anti-cloaking sensors. This is of course reflective of the fact that it is going to be on the Romulan border, and that its sensors are going to have to penetrate the latest and greatest in Romulan cloaking technology. And it needs to have a relatively low warp profile so that it itself is not detected by the very Romulans that it's trying to hunt. And also, in the case that it is detected, be able to escape and survive. within just a few short years, we would see the construction of the Hayden class, with the first ship being launched in 2385, which is actually soon after the Kirchen itself was revealed. This would become part of the new neutral zone force. The dimensions of the Hayden class are as follows. It is 131 meters long, 54 meters wide, and 29 meters tall, with 6 decks. This is a very, very small ship. Starfleet's attack ships, they tend to be bigger than most of their contemporaries and tend to lean in towards being destroyers. The Hayden is a good example of a genuine attack ship. It is very, very small, and it is very, very nimble. So, on this very small ship, we of course have a, relatively speaking, small crew, though this is variable. Generally, you're looking at a crew of about 25. That would be 4 officers and 21 crew. The Hayden class is probably going to be under the command of a senior lieutenant, maybe if it's a squadron leader, a lieutenant commander, but it is going to be something like that. It is going to have a junior officer, a relatively junior officer in command. Again, kind of almost going back towards the Starfleet of the 23rd century. Get those young and up-and-coming officers into commands. This is a problem that Starfleet really had during the quote-unquote golden age, is that generally they had more officers than they had ships to give them, and this will certainly remedy that particular problem. Now, the total evacuation capacity of the Hayden class is 60, so that is 6 people per escape pod, and the escape pods are Sovereign class escape pods, and you can see them on the ventral surface of the ship. So you can only ever go as high as about 60. Now, of course, depending on the duration of your mission, you may want to increase your crew complement or bring on board certain specialists if you're going on a particularly specialist mission. This isn't just a patrol ship, it is also very capable as a science ship, fairly obviously. Those powerful sensors have uses other than their sheer military applications. So in terms of mission duration, you're looking at about a duration of probably 3 to 4 months at most. Potentially patrols could be shorter, but you're looking at a few months on patrol for the Haydens. They are certainly not going on year-long missions, that's for sure. They're simply not big enough and don't have the sustainment for that. Now, going back to personnel, as I said, that's going to be dependent on mission duration. So your average shift on a Hayden, if we go with a 3-shift pattern, controversial point, I know, but if you went with a 3-shift pattern, you would have a total of 1 officer in command on the bridge. You'd then have someone manning the con, someone on the helm, and someone at tactical. You'd then have 4 technicians who would be in charge of taking care of the other ship functions, engineering, weapons, whatever needed doing. So that would be a 7-man shift, but you could take that up to a 12-man shift, and you could take the addition of comms, another quote-unquote sonar or sensor operator, person who's looking for the cloaked ships, having his own station, and a operations officer coordinating with the wider fleet and squadron, and 2 ordnance technicians to specifically see to the torpedoes that are probably going to be the ship's primary defense against cloaked vessels. And that would be a 12-person shift, and that could either be with a total crew capacity of 36 to 48. This has a lot of echoes of something I talked about with Drakenfell with regards to the Klingon Bird of Prey. The Klingon Bird of Prey has a nominal complement of about 36 crew. However, we can see that it can be operated by as few as 12. Now, this does actually work quite well, because this implies that they just operate on a 3-shift pattern, i.e. you have 3 shifts of 12, and that's perfectly capable of operating Bird of Prey. Now, during peacetime, you probably would have fully crewed birds of prey. But during wartime, when you just need vast numbers, and also you're not too worried about sustainment, you could then take those crews of 36 and break them down into 12-man crews, and then suddenly you get 2 more birds of prey for the same amount of people. And they know how to operate on it because they've been doing it for years. And I think potentially with the Haydens, you could end up with a very similar thing. In peacetime, relatively few numbers of Haydens, but they could be very easily, pumped out when it comes to an actual war with the Romulans. And then you would have vast numbers of these ships out there, sweeping for cloaked Romulan ships, and you'd have crews that knew what they were doing. So, When it comes to its armaments, you're looking at 4 phaser arrays, 2 dorsal, 2 ventral. Nothing crazy. It does lack real good rear firing arcs, but it's a small escort. It's very maneuverable. It's highly doubtful that anyone is getting behind this thing, and especially when you consider its very narrow profile, which we'll come back to. It also has a forward-facing quantum torpedo launcher, quite a nasty punch, especially for such a small ship, and then 2 aft-facing photon torpedo launchers. These would also double up as your countermeasure launcher or probe launcher. Again, used to defend yourself from cloaked enemy ships and, put them off the scent if they're trying to pull a reverse Uno card, if you're playing a bit of cat and mouse. When it comes to auxiliary craft, you are looking at a single shuttle bay with a very small door. You can launch from that 1 Type 9 shuttle. There are also 2 work bees for maintenance. I'm not quite sure how you fit the 2 work bees in there. You can barely fit the shuttle, but I can believe it. It's not excessive, but certainly you're not fitting any more than 1 shuttle. Like I say, this is a very, very small ship. I should also just briefly touch upon its propulsion system. So as you can see, it's very reminiscent in terms of design of the Sovereign class. But what you see here is, of course, you've got a depth in the hull, which kind of suggests that there is indeed a vertical warp core. And also, the other suggestion of a vertical warp core is there is a warp core ejection hatch, albeit quite a narrow one. That is interesting because, of course, we have our vertically aligned warp engines. And also, the other half to consider is that the warp core kind of lines up roughly with where the impulse engines are. And I suspect that actually the warp core is directly, in a very antiquated fashion, a very 23rd century fashion, directly tied in to the impulse reactors to basically turbocharge them. And this would give it incredible bursts of speed, as well as, of course, having its unique flight characteristics thanks to its vertically aligned design. I suppose I should talk about that very briefly. Why does it have vertically aligned warp nacelles? Well, it comes back to the 23rd century, and vertically aligned warp nacelles had been experimented with a little bit. The first class to really do it was indeed the Aquila class. The Aquila class was initially just an experiment. They were just seeing what vertically aligned warp nacelles would do, and they found that you make certain trade-offs in terms of performance and long-range stability, but the other benefits of it actually has very good performance. You can manipulate that warp field very well with 2 vertical warp nacelles, and it also has a relatively narrow profile. There's not a huge amount of subspace distortion created by vertically aligned warp nacelles. Your warp bubble is a lot narrower, which means you're a lot harder to detect when at warp. And for cloaked ships who are already, bearing in mind, particularly in this early period, they're sort of semi-blinding themselves. So it's a very good way of avoiding detection when you are on the hunt for cloaked ships. They might not see you coming because you have this narrow warp profile. And this is exactly what carries through on the Hayden class. And for the Hayden, it is essential to its survival in carrying out its mission. So, once the Hayden class gets into the area and it begins searching for cloaked ships with dubious intent, what does it use to find these ships? Cloaked ships are, of course, cloaked. They're not going to have a big sign up saying, I'm a cloaked ship. Well, obviously, you have the standard set of sensor arrays. You have a standard passive sensor array. You also have your long-range deflector dish, which is a high-resolution sensor that has an area of 4.5 by 9 meters oval. It also has an anti-proton active sensor array, so this is an active sensor that it can use to actually detect cloaked ships. We saw them in use during the Dominion War. Starfleet reverse engineered them. So if you think that there are cloaked ships nearby, you'll start using your active anti-proton scan. You also have, as well as that, a passive gravimetric array. And this is really what's going to help you find cloaked ships. Because in order to use, people have mentioned this in like Raptor's Revenge and like, how did the Romulans get the jump on the Jem'Hadar? Because they have the anti-proton scan. Yes, but they have to know to use it, because it's an active scan. If you don't think you're going to be attacked by Romulans, you won't be using it. And so that's what's going to give them the edge of surprise. So the way that you know that you need to start using your anti-proton scan is by use of gravimetric sensors, because they can detect the microgravimetric distortions created by a cloaking device. Remember, a cloaking device is a kind of gravitic manipulation, because what it is doing, it is taking all the electromagnetic spectrum and it is bending it around the ship. Fair to say that obviously consumes an awful lot of power, and it does have visible effects. You can detect it. It's difficult, but you can roughly detect it. And then you use your anti-proton scan to actually find the ship. Now, there's a bit of a double-edged sword to this approach, because as you will notice, the Hayden class is a very good-looking ship. It looks the part, but it is very small. And the ships it is hunting, they tend to be quite big. Now, obviously, the Hayden class is packing quantum torpedoes, so if it so wishes, it can inflict, and remember, cloaked ships don't have shields. Yes, there is a risk of being attacked by a giant cloaked battleship, but at the end of the day, you're the one that holds the quantum torpedo. And they're the one who may take a second or two to decloak before they can attack you. Plus, you're very agile and maneuverable. You're holding a lot of cards here. Even if things do go a little bit wrong, maybe that cloaked ship that you were tracking has a friend who you didn't notice, you do have a get out of jail card, and that is you have an ECM suite. That's what's mounted on either side of the nacelles, is the ECM array. And this allows you to effectively jam and disrupt enemy sensors while you're making a very quick getaway. You're probably also simultaneously launching countermeasures and decoys to throw the enemy off, and then you are gunning it as hard as you can to regroup with probably a battle group of Argonauts, and then say, look, the Romulans are over here, go get them. But that's essentially the job of the Hayden. So it's a dangerous job, it's a risky job, but there are people in Starfleet who would probably do anything to have that job. And it's probably one of those things that just doesn't get talked about. You know, when you speak to submariners, we hear so little of, say, Cold War submarine history. It isn't recorded for perhaps very obvious security reasons. Even if they're retired, submariners probably aren't allowed to divulge such information. And so this is kind of the thing that I imagine the Hayden doing, being less of a direct warship and more of a bit of that, you know, cat and mouse, which I love so much in the Romulan Federation dynamic. So, fairly obviously, with this particular loadout of equipment, the mission of the Hayden class is neutral zone patrol, to continue that mission that was begun by the Akula class. And hopefully, in carrying out its mission, it will prevent any war from ever happening between the Romulans and the Federation. We hope. Its mission can essentially be described as find a cloaked ship, track it, if detected, pop ECM, and run like hell. So it can't be quite as aggressive as the Akula because of its smaller size, but still, it's also reflective of how technology has changed. Back then, you had to be a big ship to pose a threat to another big ship. Now, with quantum torpedoes, if you're a Diduridex and you realize that this thing's following you, you've got to be very, very careful about your next move, because a couple of quantum torpedoes and your Diduridex is good as gone. So in many ways, we're seeing a return to that kind of Cold War style of Tomed era, albeit with modern technology and modern starships. In terms of service, obviously, most of these ships will be deployed on the Romulan border. We have the USS Hayden, NX 90150, and the rest, first three numbers are the same. The Isenga, 51, the Adler, 52, and the Macmillan, 53, with the Kapanus and the Walker currently ordered. So currently there's effectively one squadron in service, and I suspect that Starfleet will be ordering more of these in the future, especially if tensions with the Romulans continue to escalate in the coming years. So just to wrap things up, I really like the Hayden class. I think it's a beautiful post-war design. It's different with that arrowhead design, but it's not doing it for the sake of doing it. Some people have expressed their frustration that everything has to have arrowheads because arrowheads are edgy and exciting. You know, I can kind of see the point, especially when you're taking ships that would have previously had saucers and you're giving them arrowheads to make them feel more aggressive. And it feels a bit unnecessarily edgy, a little bit like the Prometheus class. But I think specifically with the Hayden class and other ships that have vertically aligned warp engines, I think the arrowhead is a perfect design style. I think it complements the idea of vertically aligned warp nacelles very well. It has a nice flow to it, a nice energy to it. You can see this scaled up with the Vienna class, albeit the Vienna softens a lot of the aspects of the design. It's not quite as sharp and agile looking as the Hayden, but again, it works, it flows with the design very well. This feels like genuine evolution. This feels like Starfleet didn't know to do this back in the day, but now that they're returning to these kind of designs, they're like, this is a better way of doing it. So I think it works very well as a post-war design and injects a good level of variety into the post-war fleet. And it also suggests different design priorities between, again, these different styles of ship. And you have this kind of nice family tree that goes back from the Hayden to the Akula to the Saladin and to the Einstein, going all the way back through the history of Starfleet and this slowly forming branch of Starship development, which, like I say, it's all about that. It's all about branches and how things change and evolve, rather than things just being iterations on the same design. In no way is this just a, 24th century Akula. It does the same job, but it's a completely new ship. Its form, to an extent, follows function, but that function has also changed drastically. It's just a really nice escort. It's a beautiful escort. I can't express how much I still love this ship. I think it's gorgeous, it's beautiful. It's what an escort should look like. It's elegant, it's sleek, it's sharp. I would say in terms of like warships, again, as a young boy, particularly when you see them in port, the ships that I certainly was most impressed by were the Type 45 destroyers, with their very clean, slick shape and their clean lines and very, very modern. And you've got that big radar obelisk sticking up. It's a very iconic ship, and it's a very evocative ship. And I feel the same way about the Hayden. And, I like the idea of following a story on this ship with a very small, tight-knit crew. It feels very much more like a military ship. Things are going to be cramped in there. It's not going to be particularly comfortable. There's going to be a lot of tension. It's a good place to write characters. So much fan fiction tends to revolve around, your big explorer-type vessels, basically Urzat Galaxy-class ships. And I think that to focus in on a small ship, or indeed a group of small ships, operating together as a unit, I think that could be very interesting. And again, that's why I'm so drawn to the Hayden class, and that's why even after all these years, it still holds a special place in my heart. And after all, who doesn't love a humble little escort? So, thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Let me know what you think of the Hayden class in the comments below, and I will see you all in the next video. Thank you to my members for supporting the channel. My glorious Navarks, Tully DT, Rella, Sean Farrell, and Zaylan Maru. My ever-dutiful commanders, Philip Ty, Birdmonster, Jeff Hallam, Mark Philippe, Robert Kahn Strider, David Reeves, Gabe Logan, Adam Bowman, Nicholas Walsh, Martin McConville, JC Tech Wizard, Alcara Dreamer, Gloom Cookie, Der Monarch, Jamal Soto, and Tin Alt. And I salute my Centurions, Pendlebury, Marcus Hall, Julian Arnott, Freedom Trooper, Okokatum Questo, John Nicole, Athys Collection, Tobias Klein, Marzarine, Bird of Play D3, Khan the Skektal Overlord, David Jackson, Andy Clark, Quentin King, Shipmaster Valletta Petra Siren, Japhany Hughes, and Ian Hands. And I thank all my loyal sub-lieutenants. Thank you all for supporting the channel, and I will see you all in the next video.